Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sports Sitdown. I'm Sinay Sangani, your host for today, and I'm joined by Nate Martin, Kieran Costa, and CJ Roulo for today's episode. And once again, we have a very special interview with Wes Goldberg of San Jose Mercury News. He's a sports writer, and he covers the Warriors. Wes, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Glad you could join us. I'm going to start out with this right away. You're doing a new series on the trade player exception because, and your articles, you've written a few so far. Could you break down of who the Warriors really could target with that trade player exception, $17 million? And it's really a necessity because that's could be a cornerstone piece to get them back into that championship window.
Well, you're exactly right. I think that's really the debate that's happening internally with the Warriors is, do you want to go after a cornerstone type of player who could potentially replace Andre Iguodala, who they traded and created the exception with, or do you try to maybe go the cheap route considering everything that's happening with revenue in the NBA? Don't use the full extent of the $17.2 million and just get, a role guy who could be your eighth or ninth man off the bench or something like that. That has to it's not black and white. It depends on who's available, right? Like if the right player is available at that much money, then you go ahead and go get that player. If there's a good player available at less money, then you go ahead and get that player. I don't see a way where they're going to completely cheap out on it, but they may not use it to the full extent. I'm writing that series because I keep throughout the entire season, ever since the trade exception was created, dating back to last summer, I've gotten questions, who should the Warriors get? Who should the Warriors get? Who should the Warriors get? I don't know who the Warriors are going to get. But that's kind of why I'm exploring it. So the first two installments were about Justice Winslow and Ricky Rubio. I think both of those guys make a lot of sense for the Warriors because both of them offer two things that they're looking for, or at least theoretically, as far as playmaking and versatility on defense. And those are the two check boxes I think they need to look at when they're evaluating guys that they can go after. Maybe you can go after a scorer. The name Evan Fournier has been floated out there. I don't love that as a target for them because he lacks in a lot of other areas. But if you're going to try to replace Iguodala, and it feels like they're trying to continue with that formula, then again, it's that flexible type of defensive player and someone who can move the ball within the function of the offense and just create open shots for others. So there's a lot of options out there.
So, Wes, I don't know how much you know about this thing called the basketball tournament put on by Puma. Last couple seasons, I've watched it. Do you think that and the growth of that over the last few seasons, unfortunately this year they did have to shrink it with the virus going around. Do you think that's going to help the NBA end up maybe finding some hidden gems in free agency that maybe they didn't know about before and could possibly end up using?
It's possible. I mean, they're going to have to go a lot of different routes, especially because we're not going to have summer league this time. And executives I talked to, they're going to miss summer league, not because they want to evaluate their top pick or whoever it's going to be, but because that's the way you find, the 15th guy on the roster, the guys that you want to use your two-way contracts on. Think about that. Like with the Warriors, how many guys have they found in summer league just to fill out their G League rosters? So when you talk about the basketball tournament, when you talk about other leagues, European leagues, whatever it might be, they're gonna exhaust every option that they have to not only fill out the end of their roster, but moreover to fill out the G League roster. Like that Santa Cruz roster, that's gonna be tough to fill without the summer league and without all these basketball tournaments in college that got canceled. All right, like a ton of these conference tournaments that we didn't have March Madness, everything got canceled. So there's not a lot of options to evaluate players. So they're gonna exhaust every option they have.
And obviously, with evaluating players, a big part of that is the draft. And the Warriors this year get a guaranteed top 5 pick. I've heard a lot of named options carried around wherever we use the selection to pick someone, or if we trade it. If we were to trade it, what should the Warriors be looking to get back? Any particular players that we can target?
I think you have to find a player who is young and probably has his best basketball ahead of him still, but can obviously contribute right away. Something in the age range of 24 to 27, something like right around there, who could, again, contribute right away, but also maybe become the guy when Steph and Clay and Draymond start to age into the next phase of their career. That's going to be hard to find. One name that's floated out there, for example, all the time is Aaron Gordon, right? He's 24 years old. He's 6'8", 220. He could play the 4. He can even play some 5 for you. He could play some 3 for you. He'd be a good fit for what Golden State is looking for as far as those other things I was talking about. One of the best passing bigs in the league, very versatile on defense. I mean, he checks a lot of those boxes. But does Orlando want to trade him for a top 5 pick? I mean, a lot of these guys, like if you're going to trade a good young player, you're probably wanting to get a much better player in return, not another worse younger player, especially if you're a team like Orlando who's trying to make a jump to the playoffs. A lot of these teams with those young players are trying to get to the playoffs. So it really depends on who's out there. Like a top 5 pick for Aaron Gordon seems like good value for the Warriors. A top 5 pick for a guy like Miles Turner could be a good value for the Warriors, even though I'm a little anti spending that much money on a center, and I think they are too. But just as an example, like those are the guys. But I don't know that the Indiana Pacers and the Orlando Magic, for example, want a top 5 pick on their roster. And everybody says this is a bad draft. Even the teams that aren't in the top 5, guaranteed to have a top 5 pick, know that this is a quote unquote bad draft. They're not stupid. Like they understand, like they see the draft boards too. So I think it's going to be really tough. I hear that idea of trading back or trading out for who? Like, I don't know who the answer is. It's much easier said than done. I think ultimately the Warriors are going to be stuck with this pick for, lack of a better term, and they're going to have to end up using it.
Is that the mindset of the Warriors though? Because they could go younger and they could, get a player like, Edwards or Wiseman and wait till this dynasty and Steph and Clay age out and Draymond age out? Or do they want that 4th and final piece that can supplement another championship run? What is their mindset?
I think their mindset, it's 2 different things. Initially, they want to use this pick. They've put in the work organizationally on this draft. They've been preparing for a top 5 pick since, the middle of December. They knew they were going to be bad. And you kind of owe it to yourself as an organization to trust your entire scouting department in the work that they've done. I mean, they have done so much work on this draft, overseas, everything that you could, like, so much scouting. Joe Lacob has scouted players. I don't know how much you trust Joe Lacob's opinion on prospects, but he's done it. So from the top down, they've been working on this thing. So to trade out of it completely does a sort of disservice to a lot of your company employees who have put a year's worth of work into this. So just organizationally, culturally speaking, you kind of need to use it in some respect. You can't trade out completely, I don't think. And I think that matters to them, especially given that this is going to be the highest pick they've had in, more than 10 years. So there's that. I also think with the pick, they want to add somebody who can maybe take the baton years from now, but can also contribute right away. And I think Warriors fans have likened this draft ever since Steph Curry got hurt against the Suns in October. They've likened this draft to, this could be when the Spurs took Tim Duncan, right? They had David Robinson. They took Tim Duncan at number 1 and it just continued this thing for 20 years. I always hated that analogy. I just thought it fell really short because those Spurs teams didn't have the championship infrastructure that these Warriors teams do. To me, this is more like when the Spurs drafted Kawhi Leonard, right? They traded up and drafted Kawhi Leonard. They had the trio in place that were aging into a pretty clear next phase of their careers. They get Kawhi. He jumps in as a 3-and-D type player for a couple of years and then blossoms, develops into a league MVP. That would be best case scenario for the Warriors. You go get a guy in the top 5 now who can play right away, be one of your top 7 or 8 guys in your rotation, play meaningful minutes, play meaningful playoff minutes, and then in 2 or 3 years, blossom into something more than that. That, to me, is the best case scenario.
So speaking of the draft here, do you have any idea or even any theories about how the draft lottery and the middle, like the last 7 to 10 picks are going to work with the Wizards and Hornets playing a different amount of games? When the season ended, the Hornets had 1 less wins, and now the Wizards are playing an extra 7. Do you have any idea how the draft lottery is going to work with teams playing a different number of games?
Yeah, there's been a couple of ideas floated out there. I guess they're going to wait. They're going to kind of play the results, it sounds like, a little bit. I can't imagine it fluctuating too much. I think you've got your 14 teams in the lottery. You've got some of those teams that are included in the top 10 there. But I would imagine that the teams that are not invited to Central Florida for the bubble. They're going to be locked in, and then you might have some movement, some little bit movement at the end of the lottery. But ultimately, you could smooth out the odds. You can cap them to where, as far as they go, like because Washington was invited to the bubble, are they even allowed to jump into the top 5? I think that's a legit question. I think it depends on how this whole thing plays out.
Could that lead to teams like the Suns and Wizards tanking and just playing no starters for risk of injury and to move up?
It could. I don't know that they have to. Both of those teams kind of suck. So they're not going to be very good to begin with. I don't even know how many. I don't think you risk Bradley Beal's health. I think if Phoenix, they go into this thing and they realize, you know what, we just don't have the horses for this. Let's not risk Devin Booker's health. Let's not risk DeAndre Ayton's health. I could certainly see that. I think they would frame it that way, right? They would frame it with health. They could just say, hey, Devin Booker, go back to Phoenix, get out of here. They could do something like that. Maybe, and I think, again, they would frame it under health. I don't think they're going to have to go as far as to have to tank because, like I said, they really don't belong there in the first place. They're really not as good as most of those other teams.
Let's go back to the Warriors draft plans. We mentioned the possibility of them trading, but if they were to keep that top 5 pick, what is the dream player for the Warriors in this situation?
If they get the number 1 pick, I think Anthony Edwards is the guy. He checks too many boxes for them. Super physical, super athlete. And that's something that's really hard to find with a mid-level exception, even the traded player exception in free agency. And this team lacks high-end athletes, right? Andrew Wiggins is the best athlete on the roster. I think the second best athlete on the roster is probably Marquise Chris at the 5 spot. So this is not a team that is just flush with athleticism. They could definitely use that. Even when you lose Andre Iguodala, we talk about his basketball IQ and his playmaking and all this stuff. He was a great athlete, even at 33, 34, 35 years old. They need that, and Anthony Edwards can provide that. He's, again, one of those players, to go back to the Kawhi Leonard analogy. He can walk in right away, guard several different positions. He's a good catch and shoot player. He can hit open threes when he has them, and you put him on court with Steph and Clay and Draymond making plays for him and creating open shots for him. He can get to the rim. He could do a lot of those things. And then, of course, he's one of the youngest players in the draft. He's 18 years old. He's got a huge ceiling, a really high ceiling that he could potentially blossom and hit. So Anthony Edwards, to me, would be the guy. I would stay away from guys like James Wiseman. Traditional plotting centers, they just don't make sense in today's NBA. You don't want to pay them what the Warriors would have to pay them in the top 5. We're talking about $8 to $11 million a year. The Warriors have not done that under the Steve Kerr era. They approach the center position like a pitching bullpen, right? Situational guys for different points in the game. If you're paying one of them $10 million and he's 19, 20 years old, and you got to play him for developmental purposes, not only, in addition to the salary that he makes, you're taking away, opportunity from a lot of these other guys. So I just don't see them using a center or a pick on a traditional center like Wiseman. So I think the best case for them, go get a wing who can guard a few different positions. He can unlock different lineups for you. Maybe Andrew Wiggins is able to go to the 4. Eric Paschall is able to play the 4 or the 5, even in some lineups, whatever it may be. That, to me, is where they should go. So I look at guys like Anthony Edwards. I love Tyrese Halliburton for them. I think he does a lot of those things that I was talking about. And then Devin Vassell from Florida State, I think, is a good pick, or a wing kind of like him. Those are the guys I'd be zeroing in on if I were the Warriors.
So in this situation, you're also studying out like a more modern center, like Onyeka Okongwu out of USC.
I don't mind him only because we don't know about Kevon Looney's long-term health, and I'm skeptical because even his past health has not been good. So I have no real reason to believe he's ever going to be healthy and play 70 games in a season. And Kevon Looney, when I talk about that bullpen center type approach, he's the switchable guy, right? He's the pick and roll coverer. And if he's not healthy, they don't really have that unless Marquise Chris makes significant strides in that area. So if you want to go with Onyeka Okongwu I think that makes a lot of sense for them. He's also a really good playmaker. He's a prolific scorer, at least he was at USC. So I think he could fill some needs. And he's the only center that I have in the top 10 on my fake Warriors big board. I don't think Wiseman should even be on their board. But I think Okongwu makes a lot of sense for them.
And then finally, last player that I personally really like in this draft, the most polarizing player in college basketball last year in my eyes was Obi Toppin. What are your views on him and the Warriors?
He fills a need as far as I think they still need to replace the scoring left by Kevin Durant. And I'm not sure Wiggins is going to be enough to do that. Well, we know Wiggins is not going to be enough to do that. Nobody can score like Kevin Durant, right? So with that considered, how do you replace that? You're going to also have to remember, like, you're going to dial back Steph Curry's minutes next year, probably. Steve Kerr has said as much. Klay Thompson, you could rely on him for a little bit more scoring, but what does he look like coming off of the knee surgery? So I think they still need to add a little bit more juice on offense, and Obi Toppin would do that right away, right? Like, he can hit threes from the corner. He can get to the rim. He was a prolific scorer in college. And so for that reason, I think he's an interesting fit. He's got the length and everything to play the four next to Draymond Green. But then what happens to guys like Eric Paschall? He gets buried behind Obi Toppin, and they like Paschall. I don't think that's a reason not to take Obi Toppin. But then there's defensive concerns with Toppin as well. He doesn't slide his feet well. He doesn't get in front of players that well. Does that mean he can't play next to Draymond Green? Because the whole idea to take him would be to play him next to Draymond Green. I don't know. That depends on their evaluation. I know that they're pretty high on Obi Toppin in general, so I think they feel like they can deal with it. I think he's very much in play for the Warriors in the top 5. I'll say that. I'm not as high on him probably as they are, but they probably know more than I do. So,
speaking of this year's draft, everyone is saying that it's one of the worst drafts we've seen in a long time. Is there any sleepers later in the draft past the top 10, top 5 that you can see becoming a young star in the league?
So it's funny that you asked me that because I guess on my little Zoom screen here, it says Wes G Locked on Warriors. So I guess I get a free plug for my podcast. And I asked Jonathan Tjarks from The Ringer that exact question yesterday. And he said Patrick Williams out of Florida State. And a lot of people are looking at Devin Vassell as the wing out of Florida State, who I really like. But Patrick Williams, I talked to Tjarks about that. And then I went back and watched some film. And he's really interesting as a prospect. I mean, he is again just a 6'8" type of wing with a 6'10", 6'11" wingspan, really physical, like 220. He's got a frame that he can keep growing into. He can end up at like 230, 235 probably. And didn't start at Florida State as a freshman, but played a bunch of minutes, was really part of their core rotation, and has a natural ability to protect the rim. Reminds me a little bit of like PJ Tucker. He can shoot threes. He's like just one of these 3-and-D4 or 3-and-D power forward types, and it's easy to project him within the Warriors lineup. And I think if they were to take him in the top 5, or maybe they trade back in the lottery or something and select him there, you could slot him in right away, play him instead of Draymond Green when Draymond Green's on the bench. You could play him next to Draymond Green because he has enough length there. And again, you watch the film when he's at Florida State, and he is not afraid to challenge guys at the rim. And I mentioned having to replace Kevin Durant's scoring. They're going to have to replace Kevin Durant's defense. I mean, you could argue that Kevin Durant was the best center in the league for a couple of years there because he was protecting the rim just as much as Draymond Green was. And they're going to miss that a lot. They don't have that kind of length. You're not going to have that rim protection if you're playing Andrew Wiggins at the 4 and Draymond Green at the 5. They need to replace that specifically at that power forward spot. And I think Patrick Williams could do that. And I think he could do that for the Warriors. I think he could do that for a lot of different teams because a lot of teams are looking for that type of player. So it wouldn't shock me if years down the line we're looking at Patrick Williams, maybe not as the best player in this draft, but he has like the outline of a guy who could blossom and be like, oh wow, I can't believe he went 13 overall. He's the 3rd best player in that draft or whatever.
So Wes, overall Warriors have lost a bunch of the guys from the championship run teams. We've lost Durant. We had Thompson out for a bit. We've had Curry out for a bit. We just lost Iguodala. Do you think the Warriors should focus more on the draft, or do you think they should be focusing more on their G League and trying to maybe get some guys that they've tried to develop for a couple of years and then bring them up?
It's an interesting question. I think you got to focus on the draft right now or in the next 2 years, because you've got not only this top 5 pick, but you got the pick coming home from Minnesota next year, which is probably going to be in the lottery. And you just can't replace that kind of asset. You can't replace that kind of player that you're going to get. And I do think part of this year, even before Steph went down and before Klay Thompson was ruled out for the season, there was a focus to get younger, right? There was a focus to mine the G League and that team down there in Santa Cruz and try to get something out of this 28th pick and the second round picks and all this stuff. They were trying to get younger in a very meaningful and purposeful way, and they did that. And I actually think when you look at what they need to do this free agency, what they don't need to do is go out and grab a bunch of old players again and kind of undo the work that they just did. I mean, you have a 15-50 season. You just kind of have this miserable, boring basketball season. You don't want it to be for nothing. You want to have done it to kind of create some of that youth. And they're going to need to do that too, because like I said before, you've got Steph, Clay, and Draymond Green all on the other side at 30 years old. So you're going to be relying on youth more than you ever have, especially throughout the regular season where those guys are going to play a lot more minutes. You find a guy like Michael Mulder and Marquise Chris, Juan Toscano Anderson even. Like, these are guys that can play real minutes during the regular season and develop in those 82 games, and maybe they become rotation players in the playoffs, or maybe not, but they still play a very valuable role. And so I think the answer to your question is a combination of all those things. They have always really looked at their G League team as a way to develop players. Alan Smiley-Geach, for example, like, this is something that they do. It is something that they value. But ultimately, the draft is where the most talented players come from. The top of the draft is where the most talented players come from, the best players come from, and that's what it's going to take to keep this thing going, because those players are harder to find. You can find, the Marquise Chris's and the Juan Toscano Andersons, the Michael Mulders. You can find those players just like the Warriors did.
When you start to name these players, Smiley-Geach, Juan Toscano Anderson, Michael Mulder, they actually found a good amount of talent throughout in season, right? Marquise Chris is another one. When you look at this roster and the way it's constructed, do you think if they add on, let's say a draft piece and with their player exception and maybe a couple free agents on the minimum, this could be a really deep team? Do you think that's the way the Warriors are thinking, bringing back that strength in numbers mindset again back to this team?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where they're at. I think they're pretty comfortable. It's interesting. If you look at their salary cap table, all these guys are under contract for next year. They don't have a free agent, right? And you can argue, like, some of these guys, that their contracts are non-guaranteed for next year, so you can easily get rid of them. But they don't. If they just do nothing, they're going to return the same team with a healthy Steph, a healthy Clay, and a renewed, Draymond Green, and a lot more continuity, right? Plus a draft pick. So they could just do nothing and be better next year automatically. But then they have a lot of flexibility with the traded player exception, with the mid-level exception. I mean, this is a team with a staggering amount of flexibility considering where they were a year ago in the NBA Finals. So I think with the traded player exception, with the mid-level exception, you look to add those numbers. You're looking to add the depth you lost when you lose Sean Livingston and Andre Iguodala. When you lose Zaza Pachulia, I think they're going to look to fill the center spot, and they're going to look to fill the wing spot. They're probably going to add another ball handler at some point. And then, you just flush out the depth a little bit. You might lose a Juan Toscano Anderson or a Michael Mulder or a Kai Bowman. Or an Alan Smiley-Geach. You might have to lose a couple of those guys, but that'll be okay if you can add guys who are more like a sixth and a seventh and an eighth man, which they kind of are missing right now. That's really what they're missing. They've got a bunch of dudes that are like 10 to 15th men on a roster. They don't really have the guys that are between 5 and 9 so much right now.
And if the Warriors decide to go with the plan that Sine and you just talked about, what is a realistic expectation for the Warriors? Can we see them back in the NBA Finals next year or within the next 2 or 3 years?
I think so. It really depends on how they take advantage of the traded player exception and if they hit on this draft pick. We're going to know a lot more, in November or December than we do now, obviously. But I think they have a few things going for them. Number one, they have Steph Curry, transcendent player who can lead a team to a championship. We've seen that. He's proven that. We know that. They've got Klay Thompson, who, if he can get back to where he was in the finals, was playing the best basketball of his career, right? And he's going to replace a lot of that scoring that you left by Kevin Durant, and he's one of the best wing defenders in the league. If Andrew Wiggins works out, you've got another really good wing defender, and that's what it's going to take in the West. If you look through the West, you're going to need wing defenders. You've got Kawhi Leonard in the West now. You've got LeBron James, Paul George. All these guys are in the Western Conference. You need and James Harden. You need guys who can guard those top scorers. And there's not a lot of teams that have those guys. So if you can have, and that's what made the Warriors so dangerous, is they had Clay and Andre Iguodala and Sean Livingston and Draymond Green. They had all these guys who can guard those types of players. So they need to add more of that, because right now Klay Thompson's your only, elite wing defender. You don't have any other ones. So you need to go find those, right? If they can do that with this draft pick and the traded player exception and all that stuff, then I think they have a real chance to get there, because I still believe that the offense will be okay as long as you have Steph and Klay Thompson. You get a little bit from Andrew Wiggins and a little bit from other parts of the roster. You should be okay. Defensively is where I have a ton of questions, and the Warriors do too. They know they need to get much better.
You talked to Joe Lacob a little bit in the beginning of the season, I believe, and I read that article, and he was obviously very bummed out by the Warriors being down in that particular game. But what is his outlook on the future? What does he think for the future, for the next 5 years? What is the sense you get from him when you talk to him?
Well, he's a salesman, so he's going to be selling the team no matter what, even if we're sitting there watching a game together, which is what we were doing. But he's optimistic, and you have to be, right? Like, you have to be bullish about your product, and he is. He thought that they could make it maybe to the playoffs this year. So that was the most interesting thing. I don't even remember if that made it in my article, but I remember asking him what he thought for his expectations. And, this is Joe Lacob. He's brash. He's light years ahead, all these things, right? But he was he was honest, and I thought maybe we make the playoffs this year is what he told me. He's, you have Steph Curry, Klay Thompson comes back maybe at the end of the year, you get in as an 8th seed or something like that. And maybe you try to make some noise in the first round. They knew they were going to take a step back, but they knew they were going to take a step back, understanding that they had planned to be right back in it this coming season, right? So that, I think, is still their plan, and they really don't have any reason why they shouldn't believe in that still. If anything, they have more of a reason, because they have a better draft pick than they could have imagined. They still have all these other tools. The only reason that they can't get there is because of the revenue hit. And that's really the question that Joe Lacob is going to have to find an answer to, is of all of the revenue that we lost in losing 7 games of gate revenue and losing the TV money and not making the playoffs and not having that sort of money that we were accustomed to having, do we still want to spend as much as we want to spend? Because either way, the Warriors are going to have the highest payroll in the league next year. So do you want to increase that payroll by using the TPE to its fullest extent, by using the MLE at all? And that's going to depend on the sort of player that they can acquire. If that player makes a meaningful difference in their championship odds, I suspect that Joe Lacob will just say, okay, screw it, let's do it. But if that player is not available, then I don't see a reason for them to do that. They might just hedge their bets and say, let's see what this thing looks like when we're just healthy, as opposed to just spending for no reason.
Well, Wes, that does it for our questions. Thank you so much for stopping by. Talking to you definitely made me feel better about the Warriors in the coming years, because this year was very much a shock and surprise as to all Warriors fans. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
He made the promo really easy for me, because he shouted it out in the middle there. But you can find him on Locked On Warriors podcast. He has great interviews, and he'll be doing it throughout the offseason. Also, he's a writer for the San Jose Mercury News, so check out his articles. Thank you so much for joining us, Sports Sit Down fans. For Nate, CJ, and Kieran, I'm Sunay Zagani signing off. Thank you so much.